Welcome everybody to the Data and Research Priorities for Southwest Tribal Climate Resilience Summit. We're going to start now with our welcome and introductions as we have people still hopping on. So Sidak Atna Kastan, Sidak Stephanie Carroll, Tishu Stas, Landak Melchina. Hello, I'm Stephanie Carroll. I'm Atna from the native village of Klutika along the Copper River in Alaska. I'm from the Paint Clan and my dad is of the Down from the Sky Clan. My mother, maternal grandmother, and paternal grandfather, maternal grandfather are from Sicilian descent. I'm an assistant professor of public health and associate director for the Native Nations Institute at the University of Arizona. I co-founded the U.S. Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network, and I'm a founding member and chair of the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. I'm a member of the Collaboratory for Indigenous Data Governance, a dry lab group that I lead, which focuses on research, policy, and practice for Indigenous data sovereignty. I acknowledge the Tohono Nation on whose unceded lands I sit here in Tucson, Arizona, and acknowledge their elders, elected, traditional, and emerging leaders, and other respected persons of that nation. And I pay my respects to the Pasquayaki tribe, whose people also share these lands. I also acknowledge the Indigenous peoples and their lands on which you all sit, recognizing that the work for which we gather here today emerges from a commitment from each one of us to the responsibilities we hold at the intersection of COVID-19 and the climate. On behalf of the Native Nations Institute at the University of Arizona, the Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, CLIMAS, the Climate Assessment for the Southwest, and the Indigenous Foods Knowledge Network, with funding from the Intertribal Council of Arizona and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, I welcome you to the Data and Research Priorities for Southwest Tribal Climate Resilience Summit. Today, this morning, Althea Walker will host a hybrid roundtable presentation session with Indigenous scholars who will explore intersections of tribal data and research governance and climate resilience in the COVID-19 era. Althea will guide the presentations and discussions with myself, Andrew Martinez, Dominique David Chavez, and Andrew Curley. This afternoon, Althea will host a roundtable with Dr. Carrie Joseph, Dr. Franklin Sage, and Phoebe Sweeney on the same topics, but within an applied community context. Both will be available on the Summit website on indigenousdatalab.org. Althea Walker, who will host our discussion, is currently the Tribal Climate Science Liaison for the American Indian Higher Education Consortium at the Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. She is a descendant of the Nez Perce, Hopi, and Gila River people and is an enrolled member of the Gila River Indian community. Althea is a certified public manager and leadership in energy and environmental design, LEED Green Associate. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Resource Management and a Master of Science in Environmental Technology Management from Arizona State University. Our first presenter today, Andrew Martinez, is a citizen of the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community. He is also Diagueno Ipe with ties to the Mesa Grande Band of Mission Indians in San Diego County. He graduated from the University of Arizona in the Business Management program at the Eller College of Management with a double minor in American Indian Studies and Government and Public Policy. As a research specialist at the Native Nations Institute, Andrew has worked to advance Indigenous data sovereignty for the last 5 years. And has worked to identify pathways to bring Indigenous data sovereignty frameworks to the American Geophysical Union sphere. In 2019, Andrew was selected to be a member of the AGU Voices for Science policy track. Our second scholar this morning who will speak with us will be Dr. Dominique David Chavez, a multicultural Indigenous Caribbean Araucanian woman. She is a postdoctoral Indigenous Data Sovereignty Fellow at the Native Nations Institute and a postdoctoral research fellow in the Forest and Rangeland Stewardship Department at Colorado State University with funding from the National Science Foundation. Dominique is passionate about opportunities to directly support Indigenous governance and data sovereignty and environmental research and decision-making. As a cultural Caribbean, Dr. Andrew Curley, our third panelist, is a Dene geographer, an assistant professor in the School of Geography, Development, and Environment at the University of Arizona. His work focuses on the everyday incorporation of Indigenous nations into colonial economies, building on ethnographic research and speaking to how Indigenous communities understand coal, energy, land, water, infrastructure, and development in an era of energy transition and climate change. Welcome again, everybody. And at this point, I'm going to transition over to our host for the discussion, Althea Walker.
That's Mary, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to all the panelists that have agreed to share their time, knowledge, and experience with us today. So we will begin with a live polling in which Andrew Martinez will pull that up for us. And the question that we're polling for is, how is COVID-19 impacting your community? And we'll give everybody another minute or two to populate the word cloud. So we have people, emotional, long, tough, health, water. All right, now it's really populating. Mental, biggest, and hopeful. I think there's a maximum of how many responses we can get. So we will allow for a couple more responses and then we'll move on. But as you're putting those in, I'll just start with some instructions on how we're moving forward with the panel discussion. So I will be asking each of the panelists one question that they have chosen to respond to. Once that panelist has responded, I will give the other panelists an opportunity to respond. In response to questions from the audience, we will have opportunities for questions at the end, but please feel free to enter your questions into the chat box as your questions arise, and we will address those at the end. I will read through them. There will also be an opportunity for you to raise your hand to ask the question yourself. So with that being said, we will move on to the first panelist or presenter of the day, Mr. Andrew Martinez, and he's going to give us some foundational information on Indigenous data sovereignty. So Andrew.
I'll get started. Skugtash, Ananapchugig, Andrew Martinez. I'm Autumn Degaño and Yaqui. So my name, work for the Native Nations Institute Research Specialist there, as Stephanie introduced, and I'll be giving a foundational overview of the Indigenous Data Sovereignty Framework. So we all have that baseline that we're starting with today, because I'm not sure how informed folks are as far as the framework goes. And so starting out today, we have is Indigenous peoples worldwide. We want to look at the global aspect. So 370 million worldwide, 70 different countries and over 5,000 cultures. Looking globally, look at the UN, there's no set definition of Indigenous. While that definition has been informed by Indigenous peoples, there's no hard definition. It's more of like criteria or different points that they would hit that, you know, identify as an Indigenous person. One thing I'd like to talk about here is within those colonial systems that Indigenous peoples work and navigate through, recognition, as in state recognition, federal recognition in the US, is important to recognize, because although there may be political systems and, you know, controlled biodiversity in these areas, it's very important for Indigenous people to be able to collect data and govern those areas and govern their lands, so that they're able to, you know, get the best outcomes for their peoples. So think about this. Yes, this is good that we have this sort of set of criteria here, but we also need to recognize that legal recognition by state governments, by federal governments, is also very helpful and necessary. And so part of what we do when we talk about the data sovereignty framework is remind Indigenous peoples and inform non-Indigenous folks that we've always been data experts. And so here we have photos of traditional forms of data storage. One happens to be a totem pole. The top there is the Lakota winter counts. We have a wampum belt. And on the far right-hand side is actually something that comes from my community, the Autumn community. It's a calendar stick where dates or not dates, but specific events that happen throughout the year will be marked on the saguaro rib. Now this one I think is maybe 2 or 3 feet long. If you've been to the Southwest and seen saguaro cactuses, they can get very large. And so in some cases, I've been told, I haven't seen them, they are maybe 10 or 12 feet long with descriptions etched out onto them. And so these are different forms of traditional data storage that, still used and still, students and kids still create these today, which is great, a continuation of that traditional form of data storage. So shifting over, what is Indigenous data? For the audience today, we're talking about climate. We're going to be talking about lands, water, geology, air, soil, sacred sites, territories, plants, and animals. And so for the Western trained scientists on the call, that information is what we're talking about. And you should be able to relate to that as well. We're also going to be talking about data about us as individuals, largely when it relates to COVID, administrative data, legal data, health data, social, commercial, corporate, and referencing back to the previous slide, data about us as nations, traditional culture and cultural information, archives, histories, ancestral and clan knowledge, stories and belongings. Again, getting back to that last slide there. The next step is talking about Indigenous data sovereignty. And so the definition, the right of Indigenous peoples and nations to govern the collection, ownership, and application of their own data. In the US, we talk about inherent rights of sovereignty here. That's the foundation of it, to govern the lands, the people, lands, and resources. We talk about the traditional roles, again, referencing back to the previous slides that I spoke about, how we've always been data experts. Position with human rights framework, and shifting more towards the contemporary, you can think of the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples. There are different articles within UNDRIP that cite, and if you think about it, and within the framework of data sovereignty, you can begin to see that. One I can highlight is Article 15, and paraphrasing here, that Indigenous peoples have the right to dignity and diversity of the cultures and histories and languages, and that should be appropriately reflected in public information. And so starting from the back end with the data and the cultures, moving forward to that information being informed by that to people outside of the cultures, outside of the communities, to the greater world. And then knowledge belongs to the collective. When we talk about Indigenous peoples, there's a lot of the conversations we have, it's not necessarily about individuals, it's about communities themselves. And so this is a figure from a paper that Stephanie and Dr. Desi and I wrote in 2019. And so currently, Indigenous peoples worldwide operate in a state of data dependency. Basically, we're having to create data or look for data outside of our communities that we need to help govern ourselves. And so shifting away from that data dependency towards Indigenous data governance and through Indigenous data governance and decolonizing data, we can get to that aspirational goal of Indigenous data sovereignty. Stephanie's going to go farther into the data governance portion of it. Decolonizing data is really on us as individuals and looking at how we're collecting and analyzing data. If we're looking at missing and murdered women, we need to realize that these are our sisters, our aunties, our relatives, that, more than just a statistic there. It's some related to COVID related numbers as well. Mainstream society may see them as like, just numbers, but these are our people and we need to be aware of that. Same with our lands and climate data, related data. So if we have, clans related to animals or plants, those are our relatives. We need to think about that in the context of gathering data about those in that context as well. And so the aspirational goal is shifting towards data sovereignty. And these are the ways that we need to shift our thinking in order to get there. And so along the lines of data governance, we start with, at the Native Nations Institute, I should say, we talk a lot about nation rebuilding, Native nation rebuilding. And with that, there's 5 different principles or tenets. We have sovereignty, capable governing institutions, a cultural match. And one of the ways that we talk about this is Indigenous choice, involving Indigenous peoples in the choice of how they want to move forward, what they want to see within their communities in the next 50, 100, 200 years. A strategic orientation, the tribal communities or Indigenous communities really defining what that vision is for them. And that's something that's very necessary. And then public spirited leadership, those folks within the community who are willing to take on that challenge and move forward. I think in some ways that people think about, there's change agents. So public spirited leadership as well. And so you shift from the right or from the left, the governance of data, to data rebuilding at that point. Once you've identified the areas that you want to move forward in, you identify where's the data, do we have it, how do we get it, how do we build that? And shifting back under at the bottom, you have data for governance. That data will help, inform relevant tribal agendas, inform evidence-based tribal policies. And it continues to go back around as we continue to assess and continue to ask questions as well. And so this is another representation, and I think it's a little more helpful and informative for folks, shifting from data dependency to the aspirational indigenous data sovereignty. At the bottom here, we are in data dependency. We also have data that was collected by them for them. And when we use the term them in this case, we're thinking about outside indigenous communities, maybe US federal departments, state departments, or anything like that, that will want data about indigenous communities, maybe universities as well, research institutions. So data that's collected by them for them, on us, about indigenous peoples. Then we shift to data by them for us. So data is collected by them that they then provide back to us. Next up is by them with us. So there we start to see a partnership in our actual involvement as well. And then at the top, getting to the aspirational point, data by us for us. And so that goes into data rebuilding and what I was talking about, the governance for, or data for governance as well. The tribal communities, indigenous communities setting their agendas. And at the very top, we have by us for them, where we're collecting the data that's relevant to us, informing other communities about them, about it as well. And so that kind of gets at Article 15 of UNDRIP that I referenced earlier, informing the correct, using the correct information to inform peoples about indigenous communities. And so this is the foundational presentation that I wanted to give today. So hopefully we're all starting from the same spot, and I'll provide a list of references and resources for folks later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. So next we will move over to Dr. Stephanie Carroll, and let's see. Dr. Stephanie Carroll will build off of Andrew's discussion of Indigenous data sovereignty. So Stephanie, the question I have for you is, how does Indigenous data governance activate Indigenous data sovereignty?
Thank you, Althea, and thank you, Andrew, for the Indigenous data sovereignty overview, as well as for making my fantastic slides, which I'll now use. So I'll answer Althea's question through the context of this presentation and add context to the discussion around connecting Indigenous data sovereignty through Indigenous data governance. And so I'll begin with some contextualization of the domestic and international activities that have been going around for about the past 5 years. So Andrew recognized how Indigenous communities have been shepherding and caring for, through traditional roles and responsibilities, our information, knowledge, and data since time immemorial. And over the past 5 years, we've seen a rise in activities around Indigenous data sovereignty. So here in the US, through the US Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network, efforts have included raising awareness around scholarship around Indigenous rights to govern Indigenous data, promoting ethical use of Indigenous data, advancing institutional policy and practice changes, and advocacy within state and federal governments and programs. That can be from the census to National Institutes of Health, to state governments in relation to COVID data right now. So current efforts include supporting sovereignty across research, service delivery, and policy entities, developing policy recommendations for non-tribal entities, partnering with colleges and universities to build and support student engagement toward a new generation of data warriors within our communities, and identifying new and emerging possibilities and challenges for Indigenous data sovereignty. So what is tribal data governance? It is the act of harnessing tribal values, principles, and mechanisms. So our Indigenous ways of knowing and doing, and applying them to the management and control of our native nations' data. Tribal data governance encompasses the policies and practices that tribes put in place to care for and direct the collection, management, storage, stewardship, application, use, and reuse of its data. Tribal data governance recognizes that as societies and political collectives, Indigenous peoples have been governing our data and information since time immemorial through the traditions, roles, and responsibilities within our nations. However, in the face of challenges from settler colonialism, as well as the data revolution that has been experienced by everybody across the globe, today our policies and tools might look different with roots in our cultural values and principles. These tools may be relationships with other governments, legislation such as data research codes, data sharing agreements, or as simple as something as image use restrictions. In a broader context, Indigenous, tribal and Indigenous data governance are means of implementing greater Indigenous data sovereignty. Indigenous governance is the application of Indigenous ways of knowing and doing to the management and control of Indigenous data broadly within external settings. It is the policies and practices within other governments, institutions, Native organizations that align with Indigenous rights and interests in relation to data, information, and knowledge. These policies and practices both enhance responsibilities to tribes from which data emerge, as well as to data that are aggregate and do not identify tribes. For instance, when you answer a survey and you tick a box that you are American Indian or Alaska Native, but you don't affiliate with a specific tribe. The CARE principles for Indigenous data governance were developed at an Indigenous data sovereignty workshop held in Botswana as part of the International Data Week in 2018 to provide minimal baseline guidance to non-tribal entities engaging with Indigenous data. After reviewing existing data principles, most of which focus on the attributes of data themselves, such as being accessible or findable, the participants identified 4 primary principles to address concerns related to the people and purpose of data: collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics, and their respective sub-principles. The initial draft was shared among nation-state-based Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network members, Indigenous leaders, Indigenous scholars, and allies for comment before being finalized and adopted by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. So the CARE principles detail that the usage of Indigenous data should result in tangible benefits for Indigenous collectives through inclusive development and innovation, improved governance and citizen engagement, and result in equitable outcomes. Collective benefit is more likely to be realized when data ecosystems are designed to support Indigenous nations and when their use and reuse of data for resource allocation is consistent with community values. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples asserts Indigenous peoples' rights and interest in data and their authority to control their data. Access to data for governance is vital to support self-determination, and Indigenous nations should be actively involved in the governance of their data to ensure ethical reuse of data. Given the majority of Indigenous data is controlled by non-Indigenous institutions, there's a responsibility to engage respectfully with those communities to ensure the use of Indigenous data supports capacity development, both within Indigenous nations, but external in those other entities that hold these data, increasing community data capabilities, and the strengthening of Indigenous languages and cultures. Similarly, Indigenous peoples' ethics should inform the use of data across time in order to minimize harm, maximize benefits, promote justice, and allow future use on their own terms. So the CARE principles are designed to be complementary to the FAIR principles, which are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, to promote equitable participation and equitable outcomes from data access, use, reuse, and attribution in contemporary data landscapes. So Indigenous people, scholars, and data experts actually are becoming more acutely aware of the tension between protecting Indigenous rights and interest in data while encouraging fair data in community and global research environments. Implementation of the CARE principles should be seen as a dimension of making data available, open, and fair that ensures the use of data is purposeful and enhances the well-being of Indigenous peoples. So currently used mechanisms that can reflect and enact the CARE principles include tribal data governance tools such as tribal codes, tribal guidelines, tribal research review processes. It also includes elements such as data sharing agreements, other institutional policies and procedures. For instance, here in Arizona, the Arizona Board of Regents tribal consultation policy, and at the University of Arizona, provisions within our own research institutional review board processes that require tribal permission for research on tribal lands. Other mechanisms also include the use of metadata. So putting information into data systems that tell the story of the data, where it comes from, when it can be used, who created it, why it was created, how it was created. And the use of these metadata information to infuse Indigenous peoples' authority and governance throughout the data lifecycle. So more tools are needed, as well as more methods to assess and evaluate how these other institutions are enacting the care principles. So Dominique will expand on these concepts within climate research, and we'll hear more about Indigenous data governance challenges and opportunities that have come up during the COVID-19 era, during this panel, as well as during the afternoon roundtable discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. And before we move over to Dominique, did any of the other panelists have anything to add to Indigenous data governance activating Indigenous data sovereignty? If not, we will move over to Dr. Dominique David Chavez, in which he will be focusing on centering Indigenous data governance and climate research. And the question that I have for you, Dominique, is what resources can we look to for supporting Indigenous research and data governance and practice for climate research and resilience work?
Thank you, Althea. Mabrika, everyone. Welcome. Dominique Aita Inaru David Chavez Diri, Burikin Arawak Hibaro Taino Daka, Hahom Guaitea. I'm greeting you as extended relatives and welcoming you in our Indigenous Caribbean language. I'm currently presenting to you from Arapaho and Cheyenne traditional homelands, where I work in a joint appointment with Colorado State University and Native Nations Institute for this postdoc study that I'll share with you some of today. And I just want to thank the organizers for bringing us together. And I'm looking forward to answering that question, Althea, and also just situating us historically a little bit around this work, sharing some of the findings from my previous research and from our last Climate Resilience Summit in 2018, and then also some opportunities and resources to address that question going forward. In our Native communities, we are aware, this is something we're aware of in the Caribbean and other communities I've visited, that we hold Indigenous knowledge systems that have been based on intimate observation of Earth, of space, and of time over centuries and millennia in many of our communities, and that this knowledge has helped us to adapt to changes on the Earth and to be resilient over a long time period. But we're at this historic time right now, I'm seeing, where after this long period of these knowledges being largely ignored or appropriated by colonial science institutions, for the first time in recent years, these higher level science forums, such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that's quoted here, is recognizing the value of these knowledges. And there's this increasing trend of really pushing to include them in climate research and in climate research studies. That what's stated here is that it will help for the security of those communities that hold that knowledge, but also for all of humankind right now to adapt to the increasing changes that we're seeing on account of climate impacts on the planet. And I think we're more aware of that today than ever on a global sense. So as I look at this and I'm observing this increasing trend, being an Indigenous person myself and working in the field of climate research as a scientist, I'm looking critically, like many Indigenous scholars and community members are, at how these science research studies are engaging those knowledges, and more importantly, how are they engaging the people who hold that knowledge. And so that led me to a study that I shared at the last summit. It was a global systematic review on Indigenous engagement in climate research, and Althea is going to share a link to that article that's now published in that data if anyone's interested in learning more. And this is an adaptation from a scale of levels of community engagement, which is just one way of many to assess how community members are involved in the research. And it if you think back to that image that Andrew shared with the hierarchy, you can also think of it in those terms, with this ranging on the left to no engagement, so researchers accessing Indigenous knowledge without any involvement or contractual. So maybe a community member is hired to administer a survey, but all of the questions of that survey were developed external from that community. Consultative, which we see at the federal level, for example, where consultation is mandated, but ultimately community members might share their feedback, and different decisions will be made by those in leadership oftentimes. We have collaborative research where they're working together, and then collegial, where this is also collaborative, but community members are holding authority over the research process. And then this Indigenous level of research where we're also situating the research within our own values and ethics, within our own unique historical context that we face in our community, and where community members are holding authority at every stage of the research, from design through implementation and analysis, and how findings are shared. And so in that study, looking at over 20 years of climate research that was including Indigenous knowledge, I found that almost 9 out of 10 of every climate study were done at this extractive end of the scale. So you can think of this as by them, for them, or sometimes by them, for us, but not necessarily asking the questions that we need asked in our community. And so I think this is really reflective of this colonial research era and colonial driven agenda. That's part of what we have to work through in this field. But there's also this handful of studies at this other end, at the self-determined end of engagement, where Indigenous research governance lives. And so I'm really interested right now on what mechanisms are allowing us to support Indigenous research governance, how we can continue to shape this pathway forward in this work. And one thing we also looked at was Indigenous data governance. I know Stephanie shared a definition with you all, but I also really valued what we came together collectively at this last Tribal Climate Resilience Summit in 2018. This was a definition that we worked on together to define principles of tribal data governance and climate resilience work, which is that tribal communities hold the freedom to define, collect, protect, interpret, manage, and apply data in a way that respects Indigenous ethics, values, and relational responsibilities. And these are some images from that gathering, and some of the highlights that really came out of that time together. I also wanted to share, so some of the climate resilience activities that we identified in the region from the folks who were able to attend were maintaining cultural practice and language, supporting healthy food and water systems, community-based activism, outreach, and environmental planning, tribal economic development planning, science education and trainings, and Indigenous priority-driven health research, such as on vector-borne diseases and fracking impacts. And thinking back to that word cloud, I think these are just as relevant as they were 2 years ago. And I'm looking forward to the afternoon panel, having some of the folks that were able to speak to these directly on the ground and their community efforts to share with us. Also, we identified these data-related needs and opportunities to grow, and these included community control of what and how data are collected, that we need useful and relevant data, community empowerment, that we need to find ways to honor our local narratives and knowledge bases, and capacity building and data leadership opportunities, developing digital infrastructure to support Indigenous data sovereignty, which we're really just starting to do in many of our communities, building trust and relational accountability, and addressing historic inequities. So moving beyond tribal consultation to tribal data sovereignty. And these are some of the resources. We have numerous resources at hand that can guide us in this climate resilience work to center Indigenous research and data governance. And I think these also represent pathways for decolonization and reconciliation in science that's really needed right now. This is just a few of many, many examples, but these include ethical frameworks and tribal research protocols that are in various stages of development at every scale right now, from tribal to regional to national and international, such as UNDRIP, which Althea shared, and she's going to share the climate and traditional knowledge work group guidelines that were developed here in the US. And also I have this picture of our Indigenous Caribbean elder, this abuela from Cuba, with elders also knowledge keepers in our communities being a resource to keep in mind to guide the work that we do, even though it may not be published in that sense. And then Indigenous scholarship, and there's some of these that are natural resources and climate specific, like Kulananoi, which came out of Hawaii work groups around natural resource research that I found to be a very practical guide that I would definitely, I can share a link to that later. But here in the US, where we are right now, we really lack a national standard when it comes to ethics around research on and with Indigenous communities. And so the work that our team is doing right now, Stephanie Russo Carroll, Serena Natanaba, Brianne Laurel, and myself are working on is gathering these Indigenous ethics guidelines and frameworks from around the world, from many colonized nations that are facing the same challenges that we're facing here, and looking at what are the key values and principles represented within them. And we're using those now to assess our US federal guidelines for federally funded research that is work that pertains to working with Indigenous lands and communities. And then also, one of our greatest community resources for climate resilience is our Indigenous data stewards. And so here's just a few examples of Native scientists that are working on environmental and climate research, including some from the Southwest region, and that are doing this work in a way that's culturally grounded, that's holding relational accountability to the communities that our science and our data is intended to serve, and that are looking to those communities to guide those research questions. A lot of what I was seeing in that word cloud around COVID impacts, health, water, mental and emotional health, and this uncertainty, those are really what should be guiding our questions. And it's people that are in community and accountable to community that can make sure that the research centers around that and serves those needs. And so with that, I just wanted to leave you all with a question as well, which is to consider who are the Indigenous data stewards in your community, and how are we supporting this current generation of Indigenous data stewards and this next generation so that they can protect our lands, languages, and lifeways going forward from here. So I also just want to thank those who invited me and the sponsors for this event and the ones who pay our family's bills and leave my contact information. So Hahom, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Dominique. And the question that she posed there at the end, if you'd like to share your reflections in the chat box, please do. So we'll move on over to Dr. Andrew Curley. He will be sharing with us dealing with complex qualitative data with a focus on tribal institutions in research, data management, and archival research. So Dr. Curley, you can now share your screen.
Yat she Andrew Curley Nishe Bilagana Nishlin Hanagani Bashachi Bilagana Dashache Kiane Dashanale. I'm a member of the Navajo Nation and a researcher who looks at a number of issues to energy, development, climate change in the Navajo Nation, and became interested in this question of data sovereignty as a graduate student working on research and looking at the National Science Foundation's research guidelines and requirements. And one of the things that the NSF required was a data management plan at the end of your proposal to do field research. And that got me to think about how does that work within our own efforts at tribal sovereignty, and especially trying to keep all of the research and resources that we generate through research within our communities. And so this idea of a data management plan got me to start thinking about what are our communities doing to respond to the way that outside research is approaching our problems, or issues like water access, or issues about development, or issues about even the climate. So all of, there's a lot of research, there's a lot of data being produced in and around a lot of different reservations, including the Navajo Nation, and that is something that we're trying to gain some leverage over. And that's exactly what the previous presentations were speaking to. So the question becomes, how do we think about that internally, like within our communities, and how we can strengthen our own approaches and our own institutional responses to the need to retain data sovereignty and control over these research resources. And through that work, I talked to council delegates, worked with my colleagues that you'll hear from later today at the Dene Policy Institute, about how we think about the data produced in and around the Navajo Nation and what we do with that. We had a summit in 2018, or no, it wasn't 2018, it was 2016. It was called the Sihasin Data Sovereignty Summit, and then I also was a participant with Dr. Frank Sage at the Climate Summit that was mentioned earlier in 2018. So this has been kind of a conversation that's been within this community, within the Navajo Nation, and thinking about this. So that's the angle by which I approach this question. So one of the things I think that comes out clearly, and that Dominique just talked about with some of the things that came out of the climate presentation, or summit, I should say, is also this idea about data sovereignty being for the people, for your Indigenous community members, responsibility to a public, because ultimately it's about being accountable to the people in a way that that supports sovereignty, so that you're not undermining your own legitimacy as a tribal institution. So when you're keeping certain kinds of information inaccessible from the public, when you're keeping people in the dark about decisions being made, about information and the information that goes into that decision making, then you're undermining your own legitimacy as a tribal government, as tribal institutions, and consequently you're working against your own self-determination, your own sovereignty. You're undermining your own sovereignty because you're undermining your own internal legitimacy. And so this is a picture I took in 2012 at a water rights protest. So this was a water rights negotiation between the state of Arizona and the Navajo Nation and the Hopi tribe. And that meeting was held completely behind closed doors. Journalists were barred from entering, and the details about how much water was being exchanged for what kind of rights were completely kept out of the public eye. And so people didn't know the details of the agreement that was being decided upon by tribal leaders. And so that undermined the legitimacy of the whole process, right? About the need to get rights to water, or getting water developed especially in this area in the western end of the Navajo Nation. So people came out and they protested, and they were saying water is life, and we need to understand and appreciate the importance of that resource. And you as tribal leaders need to be held accountable to the public. And so that's an important aspect of data sovereignty, is to have a mechanism of accountability internally within the community and to the public, and having a sense of how to think about access for that information. So I'm using this term complex data as a different way of thinking about qualitative data, because ultimately I think what we're talking about is different kinds of information coming at you at once. You get interviews, you get perceptions, you get your own observations of the people, you get the political economic context in which those interviews, those focus groups, and those observations were made. And so all of those things have to be accounted for when you're thinking about that kind of data, when you're doing qualitative data, and it is stored and it's managed in a slightly different way than when we're thinking about census data or large survey responses or even climate data. So that's something that I wanted to turn our attention to. Some of these things include archives, and one of the things that we identified in the Sehasen conference or summit in 2016 was that we really lack infrastructure. We really lack an inventory in places to store oftentimes physical material. And these are really important information for establishing a historical narrative of a nation. We're talking about newspapers, we're talking about council resolutions, we're talking about debates between community members, we're talking about summits that were held decades ago about really important political questions facing the nation at the time. And all of this information is kind of scattershot. It's in warehouses, it's rat infested. There's all sorts of problems with the storage of this information and this data. And so this is something where tribal governments really need to think about investing some time and resources in. And that was one of the things that people who work in this field, who work in the actual management of these resources, basically said, is that the budget has been cut year after year for data storage, for maintaining information about the past activities of the tribal government and the community members' responses to political questions, because of the regular budgetary crisis that tribal governments have. The other problem is that we're dealing with different kinds of institutions, with different kinds of governing mechanisms in tribal government's everyday interaction with outside entities. So you're either talking about like towns, which have a different accountability mechanism than colleges and universities, and each of them have different kinds of these data, from archives to interviews that were done in the past to even survey results. So being able to identify where that information is and developing partnerships with those organizations, that's a lot of work. That's a lot of face-to-face, on the ground meetings. And as we know with COVID, we can't really meet in person, and scheduling things over Zoom and over the internet becomes even more cumbersome. And so that's the on the ground work that is happening and has to continue to happen for us even to account for all of the information that's been produced over like the last 50 years of data production in and around our communities. And then finally, another thing that we need to think about is improving our internal IRB mechanisms. And so as Indigenous researchers, we're often faced with multiple IRBs that we have to go through. We have to go through the University Institutional Review Board, which is concerned about human subjects primarily. And depending on what university you're at, you're going to have different kinds of emphasis. So currently I'm going through an IRB process here at the University of Arizona, which is more tuned to the Native nations within the state, and thinking about their sovereignty and self-governance, and the fact that you have to understand how the legacy of research within tribal communities. But I just came from the University of North Carolina, where they weren't really aware of these issues for historical and contextual reasons. And so that IRB, when you're going through that university IRB, there's nothing, if anything, pertaining to the unique circumstances of Indigenous nations in the U.S. and in elsewhere in the world. And so the idea of empowerment and self-determination for these nations is not coming up in every IRB process. It's mainly concerned about human subjects, whereas the previous presentations had demonstrated there's an issue, there's a necessity for cultural appropriate research, for stuff that's community accountable. And that kind of, those criteria, those are what are more emphasized in the tribal IRBs. At the same time, there's a lot of, there's additional parameters that you have to go through. You have to get through, in that case, the Navajo Nation, chapter house resolutions, maybe even agency resolution, on top of going to IRB meetings or filling out additional forms, like through the Historic Preservation Office. Anyway, so those are things that create challenges for doing research. Specific to climate research challenges when we're dealing with this kind of complex data is, I just mentioned the IRB and the meetings and signatures for approvals. That's because you're dealing with things like interviews, surveys, focus groups, data that contain more personal information, that are more sensitive, and that require that you have mechanisms around access and how you think about how other people might get that information. And the reason why you do that is to protect the people you're researching, not you're researching, but you're working with in the research project. So the people who participate in the interviews, the people who participate in your focus groups, they may say things that are risky politically. And we know that there are real political questions that they're responding to, and you want to protect them from retribution. So thinking about the access of that material, and how and under what conditions it becomes accessible to outside researchers, that's something that we have to think about when we're talking about data sovereignty, particularly if you're an Indigenous researcher and you're thinking about producing material that you may want other Indigenous researchers to access, but you may have certain kinds of reservations, I guess no pun intended, about non-native or non-Indigenous people accessing that same information for cultural and political reasons. And then finally, the last point, I think this is, I can only say a little bit about it, but there's so much more to say about this, the political economy of the area where you're working. So when you're thinking about energy, water, I just showed the image at the beginning about the water rights settlement. A lot of times there's really powerful actors making decisions on behalf of a tribal community, on behalf of a whole nation. And that information is kept from the public. And that's because of the power involved, that you're dealing with the utilities like Salt River Project and the Navajo Nation Council, where they negotiate lease agreements that are completely kept out of the public's eye. And then that creates this legitimacy problem that I mentioned at the beginning, where people are saying, we want that information so we have a clear sense about what's being decided on our behalf. What is that? What are and often that information contains research, it contains data. There was reports during an NGS lease negotiation in 2013 generated by a business college at Arizona State University that was used to support a lease extension within the Navajo Nation that was not made public to the Navajo community until after the whole decision was made. So this kind of research has been done, between universities and tribal communities, but at the same time undermining the public's confidence in their tribal institutions. So I think those things are really important when we're talking about data sovereignty. And in the Navajo Nation, lawyers, people working for the Department of Justice will hide behind parts of the Navajo Nation Code, like the Privacy Act, to say that the tribal government is protected as an issue of privacy from disclosing certain kinds of information. So we really need to re-examine some of these codes, some of these mechanisms that are used in some ways to protect us as an instrument of data sovereignty, but in other ways are also harmful between the tribal government's relationship with its community members. So those are the things that I wanted to focus on, and leave you with that. And that's the end of my presentation, and we can move on to the questions and all the rest of it.
So we will go into an open discussion. We'll take questions from the audience. If any of the panelists have questions for each other or panelist questions to the audience, this is a time for an open discussion. So if you have any questions, please enter it into the chat box or raise your hand if you would like to pose a question or a reflection. Let's see. Make sure I'm not missing anybody.
Yeah, I'm watching both right now. Participant list and chat.
I have a question. I'm having a hard time following my finding my raise hand feature.
Go ahead, Crystal. It's great to see
So I
you.
have a question for Andrew.
Which one?
Andrew Curley. Sorry.
Okay.
Thank you for that clarification. Regarding the disconnect between tribal government and Navajo communities, and understanding that, you know, in negotiation processes, that it's important not to disclose this information because there's different negotiations ongoing with regards, this is talking about water. And so I'm kind of curious about that line of, you know, informing the public, but at the same time, when there's negotiations going on, that doesn't jeopardize those negotiations. And so I'm familiar with, you know, the water rights cases going on now. And as someone participating in those conversations, it's kind of, it's confidential information. And so we don't want to jeopardize what the best deal we're trying to get. And what I'm seeing now, being on the other side of the fence. So I was on the other side that you were at, Andrew, as an unknowing community member about these, so to speak, closed door conversations. But now seeing the other side, I see a different perspective of why it's important for that. So I'm kind of curious about maybe some of your recommendations for improving that communication between, not only is it like the technical people in the room that are, you know, providing the best defensible evidence in our case for water rights, but then on the other side of, you know, saying that we did the best we can. And obviously with water rights, there's a lot of compromise that has to be taken into account. So thinking about, you know, everything as an entirety rather than thinking about one perspective. I'm kind of interested in your feedback regarding that. Thank you.
Do you want to take all the questions at once, or should I just respond? I'm not sure how we want to do that. So.
Go ahead and respond to that, Andrew.
Okay. Thank you, Crystal, for the question. It's a really important question that you raised. And I think that there's so much we can talk about with this, but I'll try to keep it as quick as possible. The thing that's important that I was emphasizing is that the legitimacy is undermined. So even if you feel like there's a rationale for keeping things private, the public doesn't see it that way, and the public sees it as these behind the door, closed door negotiations. And the reason why it's closed doors is because you can't face a community and tell, this is the perception that's being generated, that that the tribal leaders are doing things that the community's members would otherwise object to, and that they're underselling the total rights that the Navajo Nation or any other nation is entitled to, whatever resource, in this case, water resources. And I think there's still a big disconnect with the negotiation process with water rights. For example, we have the Water Commission, whose whole purpose is about transmitting this information to Navajo communities. There should be informing Navajo communities right now about all of these issues, yet I hear nothing about them. I hear nothing about any kind of public forum detailing what kinds of compromises are being made with regard to water settlements, including things like putting land into trust, you know, which is used as a mechanism for water settlements, has nothing to do with waters, but is about preventing the reservation from increasing in size without, except for an act of Congress. And this is a huge concession that tribes are making within water settlements that is not even being discussed. And many of the tribal lawmakers are unaware of this, let alone community members. So I think there's still a big disconnect between how the water rights are negotiated and what the public knows and how they perceive that whole negotiation process.
Andrew, I might just add a short note that there is a lot of vacancies on the Water Rights Commission, and so definitely encourage you to apply. It's open to any Navajo resident who has interest in participating. And there was an open, obviously COVID had shed a shadow on that aspect that was available, but I mean, I don't know what community you're from, but the only one that they recently put into play is on the eastern side for the Water Rights Commissioner to be approved by the Resource Development Committee. So the Fort Defiance is still open, the Western is still open. There's still a number that are still open across the Navajo Nation. So definitely if you're from the Navajo Nation and you want to participate in these conversations, I encourage you to apply.
Thank you, Crystal. So we have a question in the chat box from Elizabeth Fard, and the question is, how can researchers and scientists be sensitive and give more support to tribal nations this year and going forward, given the disproportionate effects of COVID-19? And that's for any of the panelists.
I can go first and drop some info on that. I think one of the opportunities there is, and we've talked about this in the past, prior to COVID times, or timelines, research timelines, there's a lot of funding being put out that involves like research with Indigenous communities, and there are already issues around timelines there. I think that's also what's going to happen there is like the timelines are just going to be expanded, or issues around timelines there. I'll speak to that point. I'll let the panel speak to the other points as well that they have.
Yeah, I can respond some to this. I'm part of a really neat team right now working on a grant proposal, and I think I see scientists taking different opportunities and how they're going about doing this work. I mean, there's a push on this team to have Indigenous community co-PIs, for example, and really building into the infrastructure, to the research process, to the timeline, that we're building in employment opportunities for Indigenous scholars and people from that community to develop that data infrastructure, for elders and knowledge keepers to be the expert advisory council to maintain oversight, and just kind of restructuring that whole research process. So much of this work, we have immediate, definitely critical concerns, and it's also generational work at the same time. So really thinking about how are we within this research process as researchers and scientists, enabling and upholding Indigenous data sovereignty and governance into the future? How can each project be a piece to support that? And then I think the other part is enabling and supporting horizontal, I didn't mention this, but I think one of our greatest resources right now is our cross-community connections, because so many of us may seem isolated in our communities, but we're facing similar challenges. And in one community, they may have innovated ways to address those challenges. And if scientists and researchers can also support intertribal networks and collaborations through writing a grant, or just through any type of supportive role like that, I think that that is something that people can do right now as well.
Thank you, Dominique. Andrew, Curly, or Stephanie, did you have anything to add to that?
I'll say one quick thing, which is I think there is a responsibility for researchers, not only in how they conduct their research, but to actively advocate for Indigenous rights and interests in the fields and the environments that they practice within. So for instance, one of the things that I've been encouraging, I'm in public health, and obviously during COVID, there's a lot of activities going on. And so when I see researchers draft consent forms, and it says that they'll be, per state responsibility, feeding back some of the data to the state because it's a public health surveillance activity. The state doesn't require race ethnicity coming back, for the researchers to report that in the data around whatever they're doing, so testing or antibody testing or anything like that. And if we don't push and advocate for the inclusion of Indigenous peoples, and we saw this early on with COVID data, we're not going to have any race ethnicity data. So we will be invisible, and we will not then have access to that data for our own uses within our communities. And so researchers really need to advocate for the inclusion of Indigenous peoples in data at the table in decision making and reviewing of grant proposals within universities, and also in the settings of those who are doling out the money, so at federal agencies and all.
And two, one of the things I wanted to add is, especially in this time of COVID, and we're all at home, keeping our distance from one another, and taking this time, as researchers, scientists, to educate ourselves on the social and environmental injustices and just, you know, the history of our Indigenous peoples. So just wanted to say that, you know, we have time on our hands, certainly. So find articles, books to read, to educate yourselves on how we came here in respect to COVID-19 and the climate crisis. So the next question that we have is from Paulette Blanchard. The question is, how can tribal colleges and universities be supported in developing and protecting data for themselves in their specific tribal community, and then considering international tribal universities like the Southwestern, what is it called? Southwestern Indian Polytechnic Institute and Haskell Indian Nations out of Kansas.
This is a really important question, and one of the things that myself and Desi Rodriguez Lone Bears have contemplated for a long time, and just never really adequately started up for a number of reasons. So SIPI has done some, so that's the Southwestern Indian Polytech Institute, has done some kind of pilot work around including in Indigenous data capacity building across all majors. So not just focusing on data fluency and use within, for instance, like engineering, but also infusing it into a discipline such as early childhood education. So everybody has a baseline understanding, not only of how to interact with data, but what are the critical questions that you need to ask, thinking back to Andrew Curley's presentation, as an active participant in society. What are the things that you should be asking when you hear that somebody is presenting data or a decision that's been made on information that you may or may not have access to? And so I think building up those critical foundations around data within education, but also linking and exposing some of the work that tribal colleges are doing to promote you know, STEM education and also the rights and interests of Indigenous peoples within those spheres. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done. We had, before COVID, in New Mexico, gotten some, the U.S. Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network from the Kellogg Foundation and with the Albuquerque Area Indian Health Board, and SIPI was going to hold a session on Indigenous data sovereignty focused on tribal colleges, hosted by SIPI, with some of those students and faculty there kind of guiding the conversation. That's been put indefinitely on hold and will probably take a turn in terms of focus, but I think there needs to be ramped up engagement, and we recognize that.
Thank you, Stephanie. Dominique, did you have a response?
Yeah, I mean, I'll keep it short because there's other questions, but I was thinking, I wrote down this quote from Andrew's slide about, Andrew Curley's slide, about what is the difference between protecting human subjects and doing cultural appropriate community accountable research. And I think in our colleges and universities, there's a lot of support from the administration that we need in terms of enhancing our current protocols and trainings for researchers to go beyond human subjects, to think about how we hold relational accountability in the work that we're doing and how we address those historical injustices that you referenced, Althea, too.
Thank you. And the next question is moving on down, and I know Andrew Curley provided some a response from Monica Bilka in respect to higher education, and her question is, do you know of anyone who is working on teaching data sovereignty within STEM or sustainability in higher education? For example, are there readings or open education resources on the topics of data sovereignty, Indigenous knowledges, science and Western science, and the historical and ethical issues that are important for understanding data sovereignty? I am thinking about this in terms of training our future researchers, both Indigenous and non, and thank you for all the links that have already been shared.
I'm gonna try to talk, but I have a FedEx delivery and dogs, so it's a little exciting over here. So I think, so we've dropped in some more free resources, and we do at the University of Arizona, we have a couple of courses that focus specifically on Indigenous data sovereignty or research governance, and so
Were you going to mention JIT? You want me to? Okay, so
Please do that.
yeah, so January in Tucson, there's a whole suite of courses. Stephanie and I, for example, are co-teaching one on Indigenous research governance, which we touched on today. And there's another course on Indigenous data sovereignty. They'll all be remote because of COVID. So it also makes it, you know, an easier opportunity for some of you all to attend. If the link is not there, I'll drop in the link to register for those JIT courses.
Thank you, Dominique. And then the next question we have is from Donna. What are the issues about ownership of the data when foundations fund Indigenous-led NGO?
So I think really that one of the core important aspects to remember is, you know, the rights holders to data are Indigenous peoples. So they're not our nonprofits, but we have responsibilities as institutions, especially as Indigenous institutions. And so some of the work that I know some nonprofits are doing are setting up their own guidelines and responsibilities for how to steward either the data they collect. So something like if you think about an institution like the American Indian College Fund, they have a lot of data about Indigenous students, Indigenous peoples, right? And tribal affiliations. So what, you know, considering what are their responsibilities? And then the NABS, the National, the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition is working to digitize boarding school records. And so they've set up a really comprehensive policy and process for themselves to make sure that they are getting permissions for what they digitize and for including metadata in terms of attribution and provenance. So whose information it is and who holds the responsibility for caring for that information, like what tribe within their system, so that they're not sharing things that that shouldn't be included. And then I know other institutions such as the Urban Indian Health Institute has set forth its own processes for how they might share their data about Indigenous peoples that they hold and what their responsibilities are. So how they will allow researchers to use or not use that data. So there are a number of considerations and responsibilities. And I think, you know, linking in the foundation aspect, foundations are really kind of just beginning to come upon how do they interact with Indigenous nonprofits, not alone Indigenous nations around this data ownership, not only the ownership aspects, but how they might be colonizing in their ways in terms of what they're requiring for reporting of outcomes data and data itself. And, you know, there is a transition, I think, happening. Many of the large foundations, my experience has been that these rights and interests really conflict with a lot of their board and foundational values and how they've practiced for decades. And so a shift needs to happen.
Thank you. The next question is for Stephanie. Who did you say is digitizing boarding school records?
I'll put the link in the chat.
All right, we have about 8 minutes. Do we have any other questions from the audience?
I had another resource, thinking about Monica's question, going back to that, what could be helpful. So a couple of years ago, I went out and collected data sharing agreements, and I was looking to see what areas they were focused on. Is it human health related? Is it environmentally related? And so I wanted to drop this one in for Monica or anyone else who may be interested. This was a study, Harding et al., and that I came across that had to deal with human subject research, but also environmental cultural research as well. It doesn't necessarily get into Well, it does get into, well, it's data sharing, so it does get into indigenous data sovereignty. But this is a study that I found that was also helpful, this, if you want to read through this one. And the citations in the back and references are actually very helpful as well, leading into that.
Thank you, Andrew. And there's additional links that have been put into the chat box. So if we don't have any further questions from the audience, I just wanted to ask one last question to the panelists. And in respect to Indigenous data governance and sovereignty, are there any weaknesses or gaps that you've observed based on COVID-19? So anything that has been made apparent in what you've observed in your own communities, in any of the projects that you're working on or going to work on in the near future. So any reflections on that you'd like to share with us?
I'm at risk of making myself a subject to political retribution. I just interviewed a professor at Dene College, Christine Ami, who was critical of some of these trials, these vaccine trials that the Navajo Nation is partnering with Johns Hopkins and Pfizer Corporation, that the Navajo Nation is making. Like, so the tribal government and these entities are making this agreement, and it's kind of skirting the normal IRB process. And so we're asking questions about why that is. So, and that's having directly to relate to COVID. So again, it's like these large, the problem becomes like these large entities can pressure our oversight institutions, our tribal institutions, to agree to these things, even if we're talking about like empowering sovereignty and having these kind of ideals, and we're putting those forward. In practice, they can be squashed just by the sheer power differentials between the different organizations involved. So that's just really a short way to put it. Sorry, I couldn't be better, but that's my observation.
That's something that we talk about when previously to COVID again. One of the topics that came out of the 2019 Indigenous Data Sovereignty Summit that we had at Arizona State, and that policy brief is actually listed on our website as well. I can drop it in the chat. But for researchers, and it goes back to one of the previous questions as well, for researchers to understand the history of research in Indian country, or more specific, the communities that they want to partner with, but also understanding the hierarchy and power imbalance that has existed, that continues to exist, and how the data sovereignty framework can be applied to shift that, to begin to shift that, I should say.
Yeah, these are really important points that you bring up, Andrews. I think that, I want to highlight two things that I've seen. One is, jumping off of what you said, is that really under intense pressure, right, and crisis in this era, what we've seen is what I like to refer to as like reversion to form, right? And so we may have had these advances in practices around Indigenous data and information and these relationships over the past 10 or 15 years, more so in the past 5 years. But when we get pushed into a corner, and you need more data sharing and you need more engagement in order to really deal with the crisis situation, a lot of these practices haven't been institutionalized as actual policies or agreements. And so everybody goes back to acting like what the system was set up to do, which is the system was set up to colonize, right? And was set up to eradicate us. And so there's a lot of challenges around that. I know our afternoon panel folks will address some of those challenges that we've seen in tribes, in relationships to state, in relationships to the federal government. But at the same time, you have seen massive community outreach and action, right? That displays the fact that we're still here. And we've survived things like this in the past, many times before. And we will survive this. But it's going to reveal some really difficult things that we're going to have to address. And I think that that is where the opportunity is that we can come out of this stronger. We can come out of this stronger as peoples in relation to the land, in relation to each other, and stronger in our governance systems.
Thank you, Stephanie. Dominique, do you want to wrap us up?
I see we're at time. I think that was a really good note to end on. And you're welcome to close this out in a good way if you want to.
All right. Well, thank you all to the panelists. We greatly appreciate you sharing your knowledge and experience with us. Thank you to the audience for joining us today. We will be reconvening at 1:30 for the afternoon panel, in which we'll be hearing from community practitioners in their perspective. So hopefully you will come back and join us after the lunch hour. Stephanie, did you have anything you'd like to say before we depart?
Just Janan, thank you very much, everybody, and we hope to see you this afternoon.